I was getting ready for prom when my dad burst in and said we have maybe 8 minutes before. I was getting ready for prom when my dad burst in and said we have maybe 8 minutes before they find us. His face was white, hands shaking, and he was holding a black duffel bag I'd never seen before. I stared at him in the mirror, mascara wand frozen halfway to my eyelashes, not understanding why he was in my bedroom or what he was talking about. My dress was a deep emerald green that I'd saved for 3 months to buy, laid out on my bed next to my silver heels. Kyle was supposed to pick me up in 90 minutes. We had dinner reservations at Marcello's at 6:30, photos at the park at 7:15, and the dance started at 8. I had a schedule written on my mirror in dry erase marker, and "They Find Us" wasn't anywhere on it. Dad crossed the room in 3 strides and started yanking clothes from my dresser, shoving them into the duffel bag without folding them. 8 minutes, he repeated. Maybe less. We need to be in the car in 5. I asked who was finding us, what he was talking about, why he was destroying my prom night. He stopped moving for half a second and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear. Raw, animal terror that made my stomach drop. "Your name isn't really Olivia," he said, "and we need to leave right now or we're all going to die." I'd been living in Ridgemont, a quiet suburb 40 minutes outside Seattle, for my entire life, or at least what I thought was my entire life. My name was Olivia Chen. I was 17, a junior at Ridgemont High, captain of the debate team, decent grades, decent social life, completely ordinary existence. My parents were David and Stephanie Chen. Dad worked in IT consulting, traveling frequently for business. Mom was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home. We lived in a 3-bedroom colonial on a street lined with maple trees, where neighbors knew each other's names and kids still rode bikes after dinner. I had 2 best friends, Aisha and Zoe, who'd been with me since middle school. I had a boyfriend, Kyle Brennan, who played lacrosse and wanted to study environmental science at Oregon State. My biggest stress before tonight had been whether my hair would hold the curls I'd spent an hour creating and whether Kyle's boutonniere would match my dress. I was not prepared for my father to tell me my entire identity was a lie, while frantically packing a go bag with 5 minutes' notice. I stood there in my slip and heels, mascara still in hand, trying to process information that made no sense. My dad was yelling for my mom, saying her real name, which apparently wasn't Stephanie. It was Diana Pierce. And my real name wasn't Olivia Chen, it was Sophie Pierce. We'd been living under false identities provided by the U.S. Marshals Service for the past 12 years because my mother had testified against a criminal organization when I was 5 years old. The memories I had of early childhood suddenly felt thin and constructed, like a movie set rather than real places. I remembered kindergarten at Ridgemont Elementary, but when I tried to recall anything before that, the details were vague and dreamlike. I remembered a different house once, asking my mom why we moved, and her saying Daddy got a new job. I remembered her crying in the bathroom when I was maybe 6, and her saying she was just tired. I remembered Dad being gone for long stretches, and them telling me he was traveling for work. But now that I thought about it, the absences had a pattern. Every few months, he'd disappear for a week, and when he came back, Mom would be tense and quiet for days. There had been a moment when I was 8 when a man approached me at the grocery store, asking if my name was Sophie. Mom had grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, pulled me away, and we'd left the full shopping cart in the middle of the aisle. When I asked why, she said the man was confused and I shouldn't talk to strangers. The memory had seemed like normal parental caution at the time. Now it felt like a warning sign I'd missed. How many other moments in my childhood had been abnormal, but I'd rationalized them as ordinary because I didn't know any different. Mom appeared in my doorway looking as terrified as Dad. She was already dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, her graphic design work abandoned, her purse over her shoulder. She saw me standing frozen and said we needed to move now, that she'd explain everything in the car. I asked what about prom? What about Kyle? What about my friends in school and my entire life? Mom's eyes filled with tears, and she said she was sorry, so sorry, but none of that mattered if we were dead. She started helping Dad pack my belongings, grabbing my laptop, my phone charger, the photo album from my bookshelf. I asked if I could at least text Kyle to tell him I wasn't coming, and Dad said absolutely not. No contact with anyone. Every second we delayed increased the danger. He shoved my phone at me and told me to turn it off completely, not just lock the screen. When I hesitated, he grabbed it from my hand and powered it down himself, dropping it in the duffel bag. We were leaving in 3 minutes. I needed to change into practical clothes immediately. Travel clothes, running clothes. I stood there in my prom dress slip, feeling my entire reality crumbling, unable to make my body obey the urgency in their voices. Mom physically pulled the dress off its hanger and held it in front of me, her face crumpling. "I know this was supposed to be special," she whispered. "I know you've been planning this for months. I'm so sorry, Sophie." Hearing that name, Sophie Pierce, spoken by my mother in our house in Ridgemont where I was supposed to be Olivia Chen, finally broke through my shock. I started crying, ruining the mascara I'd so carefully applied. I changed into jeans and sneakers while my parents finished packing. They each had bags too, apparently pre-packed and ready, hidden in their closet for emergencies. This was clearly not the first time they'd prepared to run. We left the house at exactly 6:03 p.m., 3 minutes before Kyle was supposed to text me that he was on his way. Dad drove, heading not toward the freeway but through residential neighborhoods, taking turns that seemed random but were probably planned. Mom sat in the passenger seat making calls on a phone I'd never seen before. Not her regular cell, but something else. She was talking to someone named Marshall Garrett, saying the cover was blown and we needed immediate extraction. I sat in the back seat watching my street disappear, watching the house where I'd lived my entire conscious life get smaller in the rear window, and felt completely untethered from reality. Mom turned around to look at me, reaching back to squeeze my hand. She said when she'd testified 12 years ago, she'd done it to stop dangerous people from hurting more families. The organization she'd helped convict ran drugs, guns, and human trafficking across 6 states. Her testimony had put 3 high-ranking members in federal prison for life. In exchange, the government had given us new identities and relocated us to Ridgemont. We were supposed to be safe. Something had changed tonight, something that made our location compromised. Dad said he'd gotten a call from his handler at 5:45 p.m., 20 minutes ago, warning that someone had accessed the database with our location. We had maybe 10 minutes before people who wanted to kill us would arrive at our house. I asked how this happened, how they found us after 12 years. Dad didn't answer, just drove faster. Mom said sometimes covers got blown through bad luck, through someone recognizing an old photo, through bureaucratic mistakes. The marshals were working to identify the breach. What mattered now was getting to the safe house and then to a more permanent relocation. They'd done this before, she said. When I was 3, we'd lived in Texas under different names. Something had gone wrong, and we'd moved to Minnesota. Then Minnesota had been compromised when I was 5, right after the trial, and we'd moved to Ridgemont. This was our 3rd relocation. I had no memory of Texas or Minnesota. My entire childhood before age 5 was basically gone, either lost to normal early childhood amnesia or deliberately buried by my parents to maintain our cover. I asked what happened to the names we used before. Mom said they were retired, erased, like they'd never existed. When we relocated this time, Olivia Chen would cease to exist too. Sophie Pierce would become someone else entirely. A new name, new city, new school, new life. Everything I'd built in Ridgemont for 12 years would vanish like it had never happened. My friends, my boyfriend, my debate team championships, my college applications, all of it belonging to a person who would legally stop existing by tomorrow. We drove for 90 minutes, heading east into the mountains on back roads. My phone was still off in the duffel bag, and I kept thinking about Kyle showing up at my house at 6:30 to find us gone. He'd text, get no answer, maybe call my parents' numbers. Nothing. He'd drive to the house, knock on the door, find it empty. He'd call Aisha and Zoe asking if they knew where I was. They wouldn't. By 8 p.m., when we were supposed to be at prom, Kyle would be completely confused, probably hurt, thinking I'd stood him up or something terrible had happened. Aisha would post on social media asking if anyone had seen me. Teachers would be called, maybe police, missing person reports. And I couldn't tell any of them the truth because my parents said contact would endanger everyone. If the organization found out who my friends were, they might try to extract information or use them as leverage. The safest thing for Aisha, Zoe, and Kyle was for me to vanish completely, leaving them confused and hurt but alive. The cruelty of that calculation made me feel sick. We arrived at a cabin deep in the mountains around 7:30 p.m., an isolated structure surrounded by pine trees with no other houses visible. Mom said the marshals maintained safe houses throughout the region for emergencies. We'd stay here tonight while they arranged transportation to our new location. I asked where that would be. Mom said she didn't know yet. Somewhere far from Seattle. Probably not even the same region. Inside the cabin, Dad immediately checked all the windows and doors, securing them. Mom unpacked the emergency bags, distributing water bottles and granola bars. I sat on a worn couch feeling dissociated from my body, like I was watching this happen to someone else. There was a landline phone in the cabin, and Mom used it to call Marshall Garrett again, confirming our arrival and requesting updates. She listened for several minutes, her face getting paler before hanging up. She looked at Dad with an expression that made my chest tighten. They'd identified the breach, she said. It wasn't a bureaucratic error or random bad luck. Someone with access to the Witness Security Program database had deliberately pulled our file and sold the information. The marshals were investigating, but it would take time to determine who and why. In the meantime, we were considered high risk and needed to relocate immediately. Tomorrow morning, we'd be transported to a temporary facility in another state while they prepared our new identities. This process would take several weeks. I'd miss the rest of my junior year. I wouldn't graduate from Ridgemont High. Everything I'd worked for academically was just gone. Mom saw my face and said they'd work with the marshals to transfer my transcripts under a new identity, that I could finish high school somewhere else. But Olivia Chen's academic record, her debate championships, her college application essays, all of that was now inaccessible. Sophie Pierce, or whatever my new name would be, would have to start over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in a small bedroom in the cabin, listening to my parents talk in low voices in the main room. Fragments of their conversation carried through the walls. Mom was angry, saying something about this being the 3rd time and she was tired of running. Dad was defensive, saying he'd been careful, that he'd followed all the protocols. Mom said maybe they should have refused witness protection from the beginning, just disappeared on their own, because the government clearly couldn't keep them safe. Dad said without protection they'd have been found years ago, that the organization had resources and connections that made independent hiding impossible. Their argument continued for hours, eventually dying down to exhausted silence. I thought about Kyle getting ready for prom without me, putting on his tuxedo and wondering what happened. I thought about Aisha and Zoe seeing pictures from prom on social media tomorrow, parties they'd attend without me, graduation next year that I wouldn't be part of. I thought about my debate team competing at nationals in 6 weeks with someone else in my spot. All these futures I'd imagined, just erased. I picked up my phone from where Dad had placed it on the nightstand, still powered off. The temptation to turn it on, send one message to Kyle explaining, was overwhelming. But I remembered the fear in my parents' faces, and I left it off. At some point near dawn, I fell asleep from pure exhaustion, dreaming about wearing my emerald dress to a prom in a school that didn't exist. I woke around 8 a.m. to voices outside the cabin. Not my parents' voices. Men talking, engines idling. My heart started racing before I was fully conscious, some primitive part of my brain recognizing danger. I got out of bed quietly and cracked open the bedroom door. Mom and Dad were standing frozen in the main room, staring at the front door. Someone was knocking, calling out that they were U.S. Marshals here to transport us to the facility. Dad looked at Mom with a strange expression, and she shook her head slightly. Something was wrong. The knock came again, more insistent. Dad moved toward the door, and Mom grabbed his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. He pulled away from her and opened the door. 3 men in dark suits stood on the porch, badges visible, looking official and professional. The lead man introduced himself as Marshal Thompson, saying they were here to escort us to the temporary facility as arranged. Dad stepped aside to let them enter, but Mom didn't move. She was staring at the men with an expression of dawning horror. I recognized one of the other men, she said, her voice shaking. From before, from the organization. That's Vincent Lattimore. He testified at the trial. She pointed at the second man, whose face went cold. Vincent, I know that's you. You were one of them. The man claiming to be a marshal drew his gun in one smooth motion, pointing it at my mother. Dad started to move, and the other 2 men drew weapons too, everything happening so fast I couldn't process it. Everyone stay calm, the lead man said. His voice had changed, no longer official and professional, but something harder and more dangerous. He wasn't Marshal Thompson. He wasn't a marshal at all. The 3 men forced us to sit on the couch while they searched the cabin, taking our phones and bags. The lead man, who Mom now called Vincent Lattimore, seemed to be in charge. He told the others to secure the perimeter and make sure no one else was coming. One man went outside and the other stayed by the door while Vincent stood in front of us with his gun pointed casually in our direction. He said he'd waited 12 years to find Diana Pierce, the woman who'd destroyed his life and sent his friends to prison. When he got out 3 years ago on a technicality, he dedicated himself to tracking her down. It had taken time, money, and patience, but eventually he'd found someone in the Marshal Service willing to sell information for the right price. Last night, he'd finally gotten our location. He'd driven through the night to get here before we could be relocated again. Vincent asked if Diana remembered him, and Mom said she remembered every person she'd testified against, especially the ones who'd trafficked children. Vincent's face twisted with rage, and he said she'd ruined everything with her lies, that the organization had been providing services people wanted, that she'd been a traitor to people who'd trusted her. Mom said she'd been an accountant who'd discovered what they were really doing with the money she was tracking, and she'd gone to the FBI because she had a conscience. Vincent laughed, saying conscience was expensive, and now Diana was going to pay the price for her righteousness. I sat between my parents on the couch, trying not to shake visibly, trying to think. These men had found us by corrupting someone in the witness protection program, and they'd staged themselves as marshals to get us to open the door. My dad had fallen for it, letting them inside, and now we were being held at gunpoint in an isolated cabin with no cell service and no way to call for help. Vincent was talking about how the organization wanted Diana brought back to face justice their way, but he'd decided killing her here would be more satisfying. He'd make it look like a murder-suicide, the family that couldn't handle the stress of witness protection. The marshals would find us in a few days when we didn't check in. By then, Vincent would be gone, and no one would know the truth. Dad was sitting very still beside me, and I noticed his hand slowly moving toward his pocket. I didn't know what he was doing until I saw the edge of a phone, the emergency phone Mom had been using to call Marshal Garrett. He'd somehow grabbed it when the men searched us, hiding it. If he could dial 911 without them noticing, we might have a chance. But the moment Dad's hand moved toward his pocket, the man by the door shouted a warning. Vincent spun and fired, the gunshot deafening in the small cabin. Dad fell forward, and Mom screamed, reaching for him. Vincent pointed the gun at her next, and I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself at him. I'm not sure what I thought would happen. I'm 17, 5'4", maybe 120 pounds. Vincent was a grown man with a gun, but surprise gave me a brief advantage, enough to knock his arm as he fired, sending the shot wide. I felt pain in my shoulder, burning and shocking, and realized I'd been hit. Mom was fighting now too, scratching at Vincent's face while the man by the door tried to pull her off. Dad was on the floor bleeding but moving, trying to reach the phone he'd dropped. Everything was chaos and noise and terror, and I thought we were going to die in this cabin without anyone knowing why. Then the front door burst open, and real U.S. Marshals flooded in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The man by the door dropped his weapon immediately, but Vincent tried to bring his gun up, and the Marshals fired. He went down hard, not moving. The third man, who'd been outside, was already on the ground in handcuffs. It was over in seconds, the cabin filling with law enforcement officers, paramedics rushing in to treat Dad and me. I was bleeding from a gunshot wound to my left shoulder, through and through, painful but not fatal. Dad had been shot in the chest, more serious but stable. Mom was uninjured physically but in shock, being wrapped in a blanket by a female marshal who was talking to her in low, soothing tones. Marshal Garrett, the man Mom had been calling, arrived at the cabin within 20 minutes of the raid. He was in his 50s, stern-faced, with the air of someone who'd seen too much violence. He knelt beside me while a paramedic bandaged my shoulder and said he was sorry we'd been through this nightmare. The Marshal Service had been investigating the leak in their database for weeks, suspecting someone was selling information to criminal organizations. When Dad's handler called last night warning that our cover was compromised, it had triggered an internal investigation. They'd traced the breach to a corrupt administrative assistant who'd accessed our file and sold it to Vincent Lattimore. The Marshals had been monitoring communications, hoping to catch the assistant in the act and identify who was buying information. When they'd intercepted messages about the cabin location, they'd mobilized immediately, arriving just in time. Marshal Garrett said if Dad hadn't managed to hit the emergency call button on that hidden phone, they might not have known we were under attack. The silent alarm had given them our exact location and brought help within minutes. Dad's quick thinking had saved all our lives, even though it had nearly cost him his own. I looked at my father being loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale but eyes alert, and felt a rush of complicated emotions. He'd opened the door to armed criminals, believing they were marshals. But he'd also hidden that emergency phone and activated it at the critical moment. He'd made mistakes and then fixed them, and we'd survived. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks. Dad spent 5 days in the hospital recovering from his gunshot wound, which had damaged his lung but missed vital arteries. My shoulder healed with physical therapy and left a scar I'd carry forever. Vincent Lattimore died at the scene. The other 2 men, hired muscle with criminal records, were arrested and faced federal charges for attempted murder of federal witnesses. The corrupt administrative assistant in the Marshal Service, a woman named Ellen Radcliffe, was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, bribery, and violation of witness security protocols. Her trial revealed she'd been selling information for 2 years, compromising at least 15 protected families and leading to 3 deaths. She was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The systemic investigation led to complete overhaul of database access protocols in the witness security program, with new safeguards to prevent future breaches. It was small comfort for the families who'd been endangered, but it was something. My family faced a choice about what to do next. Marshal Garrett said we could continue in witness protection with new identities in a new location, or we could exit the program now that the immediate threat was eliminated. The organization Mom had testified against was largely dismantled, its leadership in prison, and Vincent Lattimore's death had been reported widely in criminal circles as a warning to others seeking revenge. The Marshals believed we were relatively safe now, though they couldn't guarantee complete security. Mom wanted to leave witness protection and reclaim our real identities. She was tired of running, tired of lying, tired of building lives only to have them erased. She wanted to be Diana Pierce again, to reconnect with family she hadn't seen in 12 years, to live openly without fear. Dad was more cautious, worried that remnants of the organization might still pose threats. They argued for days in the hospital while Dad recovered, the same argument they'd been having for years in different forms. Eventually, they reached a compromise. We'd leave witness protection but relocate voluntarily to a different city, somewhere we chose rather than where the Marshals assigned us. We'd use our real names and identities but maintain some privacy about our location. Mom would reconnect with her family carefully, rebuilding relationships that had been severed by witness protection. Dad would find new employment that didn't require extensive background checks revealing our history. And I would finish high school under my real name, Sophie Pierce, in whatever city we chose. It meant starting over again, but this time by choice rather than emergency. This time with our true identities rather than lies. Olivia Chen would officially cease to exist, and Sophie Pierce would reclaim the life that had been stolen from her at age 5. The process of leaving witness protection was bureaucratic and exhausting. There were forms, interviews, counseling sessions, legal paperwork officially terminating our protected status. The Marshals required we sign documents acknowledging we were voluntarily exiting the program and accepting responsibility for our own security. They provided resources for private security consultation and recommended practices for maintaining privacy in the digital age, but the protection of federal marshals was withdrawn. We were on our own, for better or worse. Marshal Garrett met with us one final time before our official exit, sitting in a conference room at the federal building in Seattle. He said he'd been overseeing witness protection cases for 20 years, and ours was one of the most complicated he'd encountered. The breach in the database, the attack at the cabin, the near tragedy that almost cost multiple lives. He apologized for the system failing us, for the corruption that had endangered our family. But he also said Diana's testimony 12 years ago had saved countless lives by dismantling a trafficking network. Her courage, even knowing the cost, had made a difference. That counted for something, even through all the pain and dislocation. Mom thanked him, her voice emotional, and said she didn't regret testifying, only the damage it had caused her family. Marshall Garrett said that was the burden witnesses carried, the impossible choice between safety and justice. He shook our hands and wished us luck in our new old lives as the Pierce family. We chose Portland, Oregon as our new home. It was large enough to provide anonymity but close enough to Seattle that the geography felt familiar. Dad found a position as an IT manager at a mid-sized tech company. Mom resumed freelance graphic design under her real name, gradually rebuilding her portfolio and client base. I enrolled at Lincoln High School as a junior, introducing myself as Sophie Pierce, new to the city, interested in debate and academics. No one asked too many questions about why we'd moved in the middle of the year. I said my dad got a job opportunity, which was technically true. The first few weeks were disorienting, learning to respond to Sophie instead of Olivia, remembering my real birthday instead of the false one I'd been using. But gradually it felt more natural. Sophie Pierce felt like coming home to myself after years of wearing a costume. My memories of early childhood began filtering back, not completely but in fragments. I remembered my grandmother's house in Texas, the way she made tortillas by hand. I remembered a cat we'd owned in Minnesota, orange and fat, who'd slept on my bed. I remembered Mom's real maiden name, Ramirez, and her family's tradition of Sunday dinners with dozens of cousins. These memories had been buried under 12 years of Olivia Chen, and now they were surfacing like artifacts uncovered in an archaeological dig. Mom reconnected with her family slowly and carefully. Her parents had been told she'd entered witness protection and couldn't contact them, a devastating severance that had lasted over a decade. When she finally called them from Portland, using her real name and voice, her mother cried for 20 minutes straight before being able to speak. Mom traveled to visit them in Texas a month after we settled in Portland, bringing me with her. Meeting grandparents I'd seen maybe twice in my conscious life was surreal and emotional. They looked at me with wonder, saying I looked just like Diana at that age, marveling at the teenager I'd become. My grandmother kept touching my face like she couldn't believe I was real. The family had grown during our absence. I had cousins I'd never met, aunts and uncles who'd married or divorced, babies born and elders who'd died. 12 years of family history I'd missed entirely. We spent a week in Texas reconnecting, filling in gaps, carefully avoiding specific details about our life in witness protection. The marshals had advised us to be vague about our whereabouts and experiences for security reasons, so we said only that we'd moved frequently for Dad's work and had finally settled somewhere permanent. The family accepted this explanation, too grateful for our return to push for details. Starting over at Lincoln High as Sophie Pierce presented unexpected challenges. I'd been captain of the debate team at Ridgemont, but at Lincoln I was a new junior with no reputation or connections. I joined the debate team and had to work my way up from novice rounds, proving my skills to coaches who'd never heard of Olivia Chen's accomplishments. My transcripts had been officially transferred from Ridgemont High under my new identity, but the transfer process had lost some credits, and I had to retake classes I'd already completed. College applications loomed, and explaining my complicated academic history to admissions officers would require careful navigation. I couldn't reference my debate championships because they'd been won under a false identity. I had to build Sophie Pierce's resume from scratch in the single year I had left before graduation. It was frustrating and exhausting, but also strangely liberating. I wasn't competing with Olivia Chen's achievements anymore. I was establishing Sophie Pierce's path forward, and that person could be whoever I decided to make her. At Lincoln, I joined the school newspaper as a writer, something I'd never done at Ridgemont. I tried out for the spring musical, discovering I actually enjoyed singing. I made new friends who knew only Sophie Pierce, with no history of lies behind the relationship. These friendships felt cleaner somehow, built on truth rather than constructed identity. One afternoon in late May, 3 months after the cabin attack, I received a message through Facebook from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture showed a young man around my age, but the name was unfamiliar. The message said, "Olivia, is that you? It's Kyle. I've been trying to find you for months." My hands started shaking as I read it. Kyle had somehow tracked me down despite our change of identity and relocation. He'd created a fake profile to contact me, probably to avoid my blocking him immediately. The message continued. "I don't know what happened prom night. One minute we were planning to meet, the next you'd vanished completely. Your house was empty, your phone disconnected, you weren't at school Monday. Aisha and Zoe were devastated. We filed a missing person report, but police said your family had moved suddenly and there was no foul play. I've been searching for months, checking social media, asking anyone who might know something. I finally found a girl at your new school who posted a photo tagging you. Different name, different city, but it's definitely you. Please just tell me you're okay. Tell me what happened. I've been going crazy thinking something terrible happened to you." I stared at the message, tears blurring the screen. Kyle had spent months looking for me, refusing to accept my disappearance. He'd tracked me down despite name changes and cross-state relocation. Part of me wanted to respond, to explain everything, to apologize for vanishing on prom night. But I remembered Marshall Garrett's warnings about maintaining privacy, about not revealing details of our witness protection history. I called Mom and showed her the message. Mom read Kyle's message and said she understood why he'd searched for me, but responding was dangerous. Even though we'd left witness protection, revealing details about our history could put us at risk if any remnants of the organization were monitoring for information. She said the kindest thing I could do for Kyle was let him believe I'd moved on and wanted no contact. Responding would only encourage him to keep digging into our past, potentially exposing information that could endanger all of us. I argued that Kyle deserved an explanation, that he'd spent months worrying about me, that I owed him closure. Mom said I didn't owe anyone access to our story, that my safety and our family's security were more important than one teenage boy's feelings. We argued back and forth, and eventually Dad weighed in. He said he understood Mom's caution, but he also remembered being 17 and in love. If I wanted to respond to Kyle with carefully worded message that didn't reveal specific details, I could do that. But I needed to be clear that Olivia Chen no longer existed, and there would be no ongoing relationship. Whatever Kyle and I had been building in Ridgemont was over and couldn't be recovered. I spent hours crafting a response that balanced honesty with security. I finally sent, "Kyle, I'm okay. I'm sorry I disappeared without explanation. My family had to relocate suddenly for reasons I can't discuss. It wasn't my choice and I couldn't say goodbye. I think about that night sometimes and wish things had been different. But Olivia isn't my real name, and that life isn't my real life. I'm someone else now, and I need you to let me go. Please don't try to find me again. I hope you had a good prom and a good senior year. Take care." I hit send before I could reconsider. Kyle responded within minutes. "That can't be it. After everything we shared, after all our plans, you're just going to disappear and tell me to move on? What does not your real name even mean? Were you lying to me about everything?" His hurt came through clearly in the text, and I felt terrible. But I knew explaining would only make things worse. I wrote back, "I wasn't lying about my feelings or who I am as a person, but some parts of my identity were false for reasons beyond my control. I know that's confusing and unfair. I'm sorry I can't explain more. You deserve someone who can be fully present and honest with you, and I can't be that person. Please delete this account and don't look for me again." Kyle sent several more messages over the next hour, alternating between anger and pleading, asking for a phone call or video chat so we could talk properly. I didn't respond. Eventually, the messages stopped, and a week later I noticed he'd deleted the fake Facebook profile. I hoped he'd found closure and moved on, but I knew realistically he was probably hurt and confused for a long time afterward. That was collateral damage from our witness protection life. People who'd cared about Olivia Chen were left with incomplete stories and unanswered questions. It wasn't fair to them, but fairness wasn't possible when your existence was a federal secret. I let myself grieve the relationship for a few days, then focused on moving forward. Sophie Pierce didn't have time to mourn Olivia Chen's lost romance. She had finals to study for and a future to build. Senior year at Lincoln High was everything junior year at Ridgemont was supposed to have been. I competed in debate tournaments, winning several regional competitions and placing third at state championships. I wrote articles for the school newspaper that got picked up by local media. I sang a featured solo in the spring musical, discovering a talent I'd never explored as Olivia. I made close friends, including a girl named Lena who became my best friend through shared love of true crime podcasts and bad horror movies. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, not ready for another Kyle situation. When it came time for college applications, I wrote my personal essay about resilience and reinvention without mentioning specific details of witness protection. I framed it as a story about moving frequently and learning to adapt, finding identity through change rather than stability. The essay was honest in its emotions even while obscuring specific facts. I applied to universities in Oregon, California, and Washington, choosing schools large enough that I could blend in but strong academically. I was accepted to University of Oregon with a partial scholarship, planning to study political science with focus on criminal justice reform. The irony of studying criminal justice after living through witness protection wasn't lost on me, but it felt appropriate. I wanted to understand the systems that had shaped my childhood, maybe eventually work to improve them for other families like mine. Graduation from Lincoln High was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. Walking across the stage as Sophie Pierce to receive my diploma felt like a victory after years of existing under false names. My parents cried watching me graduate, knowing everything we'd survived to reach this moment. My grandparents came from Texas, proud and tearful, grateful to witness a milestone they'd thought they might miss. After the ceremony, Lena asked about my parents and grandparents, noting that none of them had been at school events during the year. I told her my family was private and preferred low-key involvement, which she'd accepted without question. At the graduation party she threw for me, she gave a toast about how I'd become her closest friend, despite being mysterious about my past, and how she respected that everyone had their secrets. I appreciated her acceptance of my boundaries, even though she didn't know the full scope of what I was protecting. That night, after everyone had left, I sat with my parents in our Portland living room, and we talked about how far we'd come since that terrible prom night a year earlier. Mom said she sometimes wondered what our lives would have been like if she'd never testified, if she'd just quit her accounting job at the criminal organization and walked away quietly. We'd have lived normal lives, maybe still in Texas, No relocations or false identities or near-death experiences in mountain cabins. But other families would have suffered. Children would have been trafficked. Drugs would have destroyed more communities. Her testimony had stopped that. The cost had been enormous to our family, but the alternative cost to others would have been higher. Dad said he'd struggled with his role in everything that happened. Opening the door to Vincent Lattimore and his men, believing they were marshals without verifying properly. That mistake had nearly gotten us all killed. But he'd also hidden the emergency phone and activated it at the critical moment, bringing the real marshals in time to save us. He'd made errors and corrections and we'd survived. He'd learned that perfection wasn't possible in crisis situations, only doing your best and hoping it was enough. I said I'd spent a year being angry about losing my prom, my friends, my identity as Olivia Chen. But I'd gained things too. A relationship with grandparents I'd barely known. Understanding of my mother's courage in testifying. Appreciation for the complexity of justice and safety. And a scar on my shoulder that reminded me every day I'd survived something most people never experience. That night, wearing my emerald prom dress for the first time since the night we fled, I took photos with my parents in our Portland living room. The dress still fit, and I looked exactly as I'd imagined looking prom night a year earlier. But I was a different person now, Sophie Pierce instead of Olivia Chen, carrying knowledge and scars that changed how I inhabited the dress. Mom cried seeing me finally wearing it, and Dad took dozens of photos, documenting the prom that never happened in a living room in a city we'd chosen instead of one we'd been assigned. It wasn't the night I'd planned, but it was the night I had, and I chose to make it meaningful in its own way. The summer before college, I worked as an intern at a nonprofit legal aid organization in Portland that assisted crime victims navigating the justice system. The work was emotionally demanding, listening to stories of trauma and helping people access resources for protection and recovery. Many clients were in situations similar to my mom's, having witnessed crimes and facing retaliation for cooperating with law enforcement. I saw how the witness protection system helped some people but failed others, how bureaucracy and underfunding left gaps where vulnerable people fell through. I met families who'd been relocated multiple times like mine, children who'd grown up with false identities and complex trauma, people trying to rebuild lives after testifying destroyed their original ones. The work reinforced my decision to study criminal justice reform in college. Systems that were supposed to protect people often hurt them through unintended consequences. I wanted to be part of improving those systems, making them more effective and less destructive to the people they served. My supervisor at the nonprofit, a lawyer named Grace Williamson, said I had unusual insight into victim experiences and encouraged me to consider law school eventually. I said I'd think about it, knowing that Sophie Pierce's future was still being written and there was no predetermined path to follow. In August, I moved into my dorm at University of Oregon, officially beginning life as a college student. My roommate was a girl from Sacramento named Priya who was studying biochemistry and spoke 3 languages. We got along immediately, bonding over late-night conversations about everything from philosophy to bad reality TV. Priya asked about my family and background, and I gave her the carefully edited version I'd developed. My family moved a lot for my dad's work. I'd attended several different schools, I was close with my parents, and recently reconnected with extended family. All true, just missing the witness protection specifics. Priya shared her own story about immigrating from India as a child, struggling with identity questions about where she belonged. We found common ground in the experience of navigating multiple identities and cultures, even though our specific circumstances were different. I joined political science department, taking courses on criminal justice policy, constitutional law, and civil rights. The material resonated deeply with my lived experience, even though I couldn't share specific details with professors or classmates. When we studied witness protection programs in one class, analyzing their effectiveness and problems, I wrote papers drawing on anonymous interviews with protected witnesses that were actually my own family's experiences. The professor praised my research and depth of insight, not knowing I was writing from firsthand knowledge. Sophomore year, I was invited to speak at a campus event about criminal justice reform, sharing perspective as someone who'd been affected by the system. I agreed cautiously, checking with Mom and Dad first to make sure it was safe to speak publicly. They said as long as I didn't use specific names or identifying details, it should be fine. Vincent Lattimore was dead, the organization was dismantled, and we'd been living openly as the Pierce family for over a year without incident. I prepared remarks about the human cost of witness cooperation, the inadequate support systems, the need for better protection and resources for families disrupted by testimony. When I delivered the speech to an audience of several hundred students and faculty, I felt nervous but empowered. This was using my painful experience for constructive purpose, turning trauma into advocacy. After my speech, several students approached me sharing their own stories of families affected by crime and justice systems. A professor in the law school asked if I'd be interested in contributing to a research project about witness protection reform. I said yes, beginning collaboration that would extend through my remaining college years and eventually form the basis of my law school application essays. I realized I'd found purpose in the intersection of personal experience and systemic change, using Sophie Pierce's story to advocate for better support for families like mine. 3 years after the prom night that never happened, I returned to Seattle for the first time. Mom needed to testify in the trial of Ellen Radcliffe, the corrupt Marshal Service employee who'd sold our location to Vincent Lattimore. The federal prosecutors handling the case had contacted Mom months earlier, requesting her testimony about the impact of the database breach on our family. Mom had been reluctant, not wanting to relive the trauma, but ultimately agreed because she wanted accountability for what had been done to us. I went with her for support, and Dad came too, the three of us traveling together back to the city where Olivia Chen had lived. It felt surreal walking through Seattle, seeing familiar streets and buildings from my years as Olivia. We drove past our old house in Ridgemont, finding new people living there, different cars in the driveway, the maple tree in the yard slightly taller. I wondered if Aisha and Zoe still lived in the neighborhood, if Kyle had gone to Oregon State like he'd planned, if any of them ever thought about Olivia Chen who'd vanished without explanation. I'd let those relationships go completely, never reaching out again after closing Kyle's Facebook messages. It was cleaner that way, safer, and I'd moved on with Sophie Pierce's life. But seeing the physical locations where those memories happened made them feel real again in a way that was both painful and meaningful. At the federal courthouse, we met with the prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney named Diana Foster, who had 20 years of experience prosecuting federal corruption cases. She explained that Ellen Radcliffe's defense attorneys were arguing she'd been coerced or manipulated into selling database access, that she hadn't fully understood the danger she was creating for protected witnesses. Diana Foster said our testimony would counter that narrative by showing the direct harm caused by Ellen's actions. Mom would testify about the terror of being found by Vincent Lattimore, the attack at the cabin, the injuries Dad and I sustained. Dad would testify about the long-term psychological impact and the continued anxiety about security. I would testify about losing my identity, my school, my friends, and nearly my life because someone sold our location for money. Diana Foster said our testimony would humanize the consequences of Ellen's choices, helping the jury understand this wasn't an abstract database breach, but an act that endangered real lives. We prepared for several hours, going over questions we'd be asked and how to answer them clearly and factually. The defense would try to make us seem dramatic or exaggerated, but we needed to stay calm and stick to the documented facts. The attack was real, the injuries were real, the fear was real. We just had to communicate that effectively. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Mom testified for an entire day, describing her history as a protected witness, the multiple relocations, the stress of living under false identities. She described learning our cover was blown, fleeing to the cabin, the attack by Vincent Lattimore and his men. She showed the jury photos of Dad's chest wound, my shoulder injury, the scene at the cabin. She cried testifying about thinking we were all going to die, about her daughter being shot, about the helplessness of being held at gunpoint by men who'd found us because someone sold our safety for $25,000. The defense attorney tried to argue that Mom's testimony from 12 years ago had made her a target regardless of the database breach, that the attack would have happened eventually. Mom said that was exactly why the database security was so critical, because protected witnesses needed to know the government would safeguard their locations. Ellen Radcliffe had betrayed that fundamental trust for money, making every witness in the program less safe. Dad testified the next day, describing his physical recovery from the gunshot wound and the ongoing psychological impact. He'd developed anxiety and hypervigilance, always checking for threats, unable to relax even in our Portland home. He'd sought therapy for post-traumatic stress, something he'd never needed before the attack. The defense tried to suggest his anxiety was related to their criminal flight from Ridgemont, not specifically from Ellen's actions. Dad said the flight had been terrifying, but the attack at the cabin was qualitatively different, being held at gunpoint, being shot, nearly watching his wife and daughter die. That trauma was directly traceable to Ellen Radcliffe selling our location. I testified on the 8th day of trial, the youngest witness called. Diana Foster walked me through my life as Olivia Chen, the normalcy of my teenage years, the excitement about prom night. She asked me to describe what happened when my dad burst into my room saying we had 8 minutes before they found us. I recounted the confusion, the rushed packing, learning my entire identity was false. I described the drive to the cabin, the attack, being shot in my shoulder at 17 years old while trying to protect my mother. I showed the jury my scar, still visible and puckered on my left shoulder. I testified about losing my friends, my boyfriend, my school, my college applications, everything I'd built as Olivia Chen. I described starting over at a new school as Sophie Pierce, having to rebuild my resume and reputation from nothing. I talked about the ongoing difficulty trusting people, the hypervigilance about security, the fear that someone else might sell our location again. The defense attorney asked if I blamed Ellen Radcliffe for my parents' decision to enter witness protection, suggesting the real source of my troubles was my mother's testimony, not Ellen's database breach. I said I was proud of my mother for testifying against criminals, and I didn't blame her for that choice. I blamed Ellen Radcliffe for selling our location knowing it would endanger our lives, for prioritizing money over the safety of families she was supposed to protect. The attorney asked if I'd recovered from the gunshot wound, suggesting I'd suffered minimal permanent harm. I said the physical wound had healed, but I'd carry the psychological scars forever. Being shot changes you. Knowing someone wanted to kill you and your family changes you. Those changes didn't go away just because time passed. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, bribery, corruption of a federal employee, and violation of witness security protocols. Ellen Radcliffe showed no emotion when the verdict was read, sitting impassively as the judge polled each juror to confirm their decision. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. When the date arrived, we returned to Seattle for the final proceeding. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Holloway, heard victim impact statements before imposing sentence. Mom read a statement she'd prepared describing the ongoing impact of Ellen's actions on our family. Dad read a statement about the loss of trust in institutions that were supposed to protect us. I read a statement about losing my adolescence, my identity, my sense of safety in the world. Other victims of Ellen's database sales gave statements too, families who'd been endangered or attacked, one woman whose husband had been killed when their location was compromised. The scope of Ellen's betrayal became clear through these testimonies. At least 15 families endangered, 3 people dead, dozens of lives disrupted. Judge Holloway said she'd reviewed all the evidence and victim statements carefully. She said Ellen Radcliffe had held a position of extraordinary trust and responsibility, protecting vulnerable people whose lives depended on the security of the database she managed. She'd violated that trust systematically over 2 years, selling information to criminals for a total of approximately $340,000. Her actions had led to deaths, injuries, and profound trauma for families who'd already sacrificed enormously to cooperate with law enforcement. Judge Holloway said the betrayal was particularly egregious because Ellen had worked in witness protection for 8 years before becoming corrupt. She'd known exactly what dangers she was creating for protected witnesses, and she'd chosen money over their lives. The sentence was 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Ellen Radcliffe was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The person responsible for selling our location, for enabling Vincent Lattimore to find us, for nearly getting my family killed, was being held accountable. Justice was slow and imperfect, but it had eventually arrived. Outside the courthouse, Diana Foster thanked us for our testimony and said our case had been instrumental in securing the conviction. She said the Marshal Service was implementing new database security protocols to prevent future breaches, including multi-factor authentication, regular audits, and psychological screening for employees with access to protected witness information. Our nightmare had at least led to systemic improvements that would protect other families. Marshal Garrett, who'd retired from the service but attended the trial, approached us on the courthouse steps. He said he'd thought about our family often over the past 3 years, wondering how we were doing. He was relieved to see us looking healthy and recovered. I thanked him for arriving at the cabin in time to save us, for overseeing the investigation that led to Ellen's conviction. He said he was just doing his job, but his eyes were emotional. I think our case had affected him more deeply than he'd admitted at the time. We said goodbye to Marshal Garrett and Diana Foster, walking away from the courthouse into Seattle's afternoon sun. That evening, before driving back to Portland, I asked my parents if we could stop at Lincoln Memorial Park in Ridgemont. I wanted to see the place where Kyle and I had planned to take prom photos, the location I'd coordinated with the photographer who'd been hired. Mom and Dad agreed, and we drove to Ridgemont, parking near the small park with its rose gardens and fountain. It was early evening, golden light filtering through trees, and I walked the paths remembering the person I'd been 3 years ago. Olivia Chen had been so excited about prom, about her dress and hair and the perfect photos she'd planned. She'd had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. I felt sad for that girl, for her innocence and her lost night. But I also felt grateful for Sophie Pierce, who was stronger and more aware and more purposeful because of everything she'd survived. Olivia had been living a lie without knowing it. Sophie was living in truth, even when that truth was difficult. I stood in the rose garden where my photos should have been taken and pulled out my phone. I took a selfie with the fountain in the background, not wearing a prom dress but jeans and a sweater, not 17 anymore but 20, not Olivia Chen but Sophie Pierce. This was my own private prom photo, 3 years late and completely different from what I'd imagined. But it was real, and mine, and meaningful. I sent the photo to Lena with a message. Closure is overrated, but sometimes necessary. She texted back a heart emoji and proud of you. That was enough. 4 years after the prom night that never happened, I graduated from University of Oregon with a degree in political science and a minor in criminology. I'd been accepted to law school at Georgetown University, planning to study criminal justice reform with focus on witness protection and victim rights. My personal statement for law school applications had been about using personal experience with the justice system to advocate for better policies and protections. I'd been careful not to reveal identifying details that would compromise security, but I'd been honest about living through witness protection and understanding its flaws firsthand. The admissions committee had been impressed with my authenticity and purpose. Mom and Dad came to my college graduation along with my grandparents from Texas, all of them crying with pride as I walked across the stage. After the ceremony, my grandmother pulled me aside and said she'd missed so much of my childhood, but she was grateful to be present for my adult achievements. She said Diana had been brave to testify all those years ago, and I'd been brave to survive the consequences. That bravery ran in our family, and she was proud to see it manifested in my choice to pursue justice work. I hugged her tightly, grateful for her presence and perspective. That night, Mom gave me a gift, a photo album she'd been compiling over the past 4 years. It contained pictures from Texas and Minnesota that she'd hidden in witness protection, photos of me as a baby and toddler before we became the Chens. It also contained photos from our life in Ridgemont, including ones from the weekend before prom that Mom had saved on a hidden drive. And it contained photos from Portland, from Lincoln High graduation, from family gatherings and ordinary moments over the past 4 years. The album was titled Sophie Pierce, The Complete Story. I paged through it, seeing my life laid out in chronological fragments. Baby Sophie in Texas, child Sophie in Minnesota briefly, then a gap of 12 years filled with Olivia Chen's photos, then Sophie Pierce emerging again in Portland. The visual representation of my fractured identity made me cry, seeing how discontinuous my life had been. But it also showed resilience and continuation. The same person existed across all those names and places, surviving and adapting. I moved to Washington, D.C. for law school, starting a new chapter far from the West Coast where most of my life had unfolded. Georgetown was intense and competitive, but I thrived in the academic rigor. I joined the Student Organization for Criminal Justice Reform, eventually becoming its president. I participated in clinics providing legal aid to crime victims, applying my classroom knowledge to real cases. In my second year, I co-authored a law review article about reforming witness protection protocols based on lessons learned from database breaches. The article cited my family's case, though anonymously, as an example of systemic failures that had endangered protected witnesses. The article was cited by federal judges in 2 subsequent cases and was used by the Marshals Service in developing new training materials for staff. My professor said my work was having tangible impact on policy, which was rare for a law student. I felt proud that Sophie Pierce's story was contributing to positive change, even though most people didn't know the story was mine. During law school, I dated occasionally but remained guarded about my past. It was difficult to build intimacy with people when I couldn't share fundamental aspects of my history. How do you explain to someone that your entire childhood was lived under a false identity? That you nearly died in a cabin attack when you were 17? That you still sometimes wake up from nightmares about gunshots and blood? Those revelations tended to scare people away or create imbalance in relationships where I was always the one with trauma, and they were the normal person trying to understand. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.